Every once in a while, in every gaming genre out there, a game happens to appear which becomes a staple. Its design and gameplay so good that it becomes a trademark of the genre, often being the game that you compare many future releases in that genre to years after it's been released. One such game, arguably, is a frictional games release back from 2010, Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Now, back when Amnesia came out, it was pretty much an instant hit, partially thanks to some upcoming YouTubers, but by a large part thanks to its clever design and great story. Even now, 7 years later, it is still regarded as a horror classic with high ratings such as 85 on Metacritic or 10 out of 10 on Steam. It has become a staple of the survival horror game genre and has spawned numerous clones after its release. But what was it that actually made Amnesia good? What was it that differentiated it from the other horror games which were released at the time? Was it the story? Was it the visuals? Was it the gameplay? Well, today I am going to look exactly at what made Amnesia: The Dark Descent so successful. Now, in order to analyze this game, I'm going to look at two of the most important factors in my opinion. We're going to start with the release date, and the second one is going to be the MDA model. I'm going to get to that one later. Let's start with the release date. Amnesia: The Dark Descent was released on the 8th of September 2010. Now, despite what many would have you believe, it was by far not the only horror game released in that time, with such titles as Alan Wake, Metro 2033, or Bioshock 2. However, at the time where survival horror was about placing you into a terrifying setting, giving you a gun, and you trying to shoot your way out, Amnesia decided to take a different approach and distinguish itself from the rest of the genre. In Amnesia, you are put into the shoes of probably less than an average Joe, with nothing but your oil-fueled lantern and your wits, and you're placed into a terrifying setting of a castle being consumed by nightmarish goo and whatnot, and your only options are to run or hide if you want to survive. Now, this mentality, as much as it's common in games now, was very different back then. Even Amnesia's predecessor, the Penumbra series, gave you at least some form of defense. Amnesia just said, screw all that, you get nothing. And that's something that really made it stand out at the time. But okay, we have a game that was released at a good time, right? It was different than everything else at the time. But being different does not mean that the game is gonna be good, right? I mean, there have been many experimental titles over the years, and only a few of them have worked out as well as Amnesia did. To figure out why that is, we need to look at the MDA model. Short for Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics, the MDA model is a framework used by game designers to, well, analyze games. If you're designing a horror game, the best way to do it is to look at other successful horror games, analyze them, and then take the good parts and leave the bad parts. In your classic MDA model, you will start with your mechanics, which are pretty much jumping, running, walking. They will usually constitute for inputs or simple actions that the player does. Those will create dynamics. Now, dynamics are a bit more complex, and I'm not going to go super in depth when it comes to the MDA model because that could be a video on its own. But just think of it as feelings that you're trying to evoke in the player. Combinations of mechanics mostly. For example, strategic planning, resource management, territorial acquisition. These are your dynamics part of the diagram. And lastly, these will be supported by the aesthetics, by the looks of the game, by the narrative, and all of that. If we want to give Amnesia justice, we can actually start with the mechanics, which are the building blocks, but we need to look at the dynamics because that is where the design starts. So what dynamics, what feelings is Amnesia trying to evoke in you? Well, it kind of stands in the name of the genre. It's survival and horror. Those are the two main aspects. So what constitutes as survival? Well, most likely some form of resource management and actually having to survive, running away from potential danger. Now, what constitutes as horror is also pretty simple. Most likely tension, jump scares, and generally creepy vibes. So let's go one by one. Does Amnesia have resource management in it? Well, let's see. Oil powered lantern? Check. Limited tinderbox supply? Check. Lowering sanity, which you need to keep an eye on? Check. A depleting health every time I get hit? Check. It's pretty much a textbook example of resource management. And coupled with the constant presence of monsters, it's really not that difficult to see how well Amnesia crafts the survival element. But what about the horror? And for as much as many of you might be inclined to, for now, I'm going to try to stay away from the aesthetics, because right now, we are talking about the actions between mechanics and dynamics. We haven't gotten to the looks yet. So does Amnesia have aspects of horror, of tension? Well, let's see the checklist. Hiding from danger? Check. Running from danger? Check. Jump scares? Yup. Monster that can hit you and therefore kill you? 100%. Once again, we have almost a textbook example of how to use mechanics to create your dynamics. As we have established, Amnesia does a good job of providing you the gameplay elements you need to feel the survival aspect as well as the horror aspect. Now the final question is, does it have the aesthetics that help support the mechanics as well as the dynamics? For any good game to be a good game, it needs to have a nice flow and connection in between these three categories. If there is any one of them that is off, it will be felt by the players very quickly and will most likely end up in the game being mediocre to bad. Now, whereas it might be as simple to analyze aesthetics as to say the game is dark and looks scary, I'd like to go a bit more in depth, especially because we still have some time on the clock, and therefore, to analyze the aesthetics, I'm going to look into the 8 kinds of fun. Now, the 8 kinds of fun is, well, simply put, just a set of rules that sort of determines what makes a game fun, what the players can and cannot do, and if all of these, or some of them, are applied in the good combination, it will result in a great feeling atmospheric game. Now, as the name suggests, there are 8 of these, but luckily we don't actually have to go through all of them. For the sake of Amnesia, I picked out the 2 that are going to be the most important, those being sensation and narrative. Sensation 1 is very easy to explain. How much of an emotion does the game evoke in players? We're talking about sound, piece of game, visuals. Now, if you've ever watched a video or played this game yourself, you will know what I'm talking about when I say that sensation is by far and well covered in this game. Now, make no mistake, Amnesia is no visual powerhouse. However, it works well with as little as it has, and in turn creates a beautiful lighting design which can be felt all throughout the levels. Your lantern reflects on the wet and dripping walls as the goo kind of pulses around you, and you have all these weird ambient noises in the background. Amnesia also takes a great deal of inspiration from horror movie sound design, especially when it comes to sound association. You know how every time when a monster appears it does this growl? Well, that way the game is actually conditioning you to feel fear. Every time there's a bit of silence, you are expecting a growl, and when it finally happens, even without having to see a monster, you know what's happening. You know fully well that you are probably about to die unless you hide immediately, and it evokes that fantastic panicked and feared feeling that you can feel pumping in your chest. And of course, the design of the monsters is not far behind. They're creepy and disfigured, and the way they move and lump over is genuinely disturbing the first time you see it as well as the 10th time. Amnesia has no problem immersing you into this dark, terrifying, and disturbing world as soon as you launch the game. But what about narrative, the other part of it? Does Amnesia have a good story? Well, arguably, the story is about as good as you let it be. As you progress through the game, a whole bunch of narrative as well as these sort of cutscenes, which are not really cutscenes, more like flashbacks, will give you some insight into what's been going on in the world right before you, spoiler alert, drank the Amnesia potion. As the story progresses, you can find many different notes, books, or journal entries which further enhance this world. Now, fortunately enough, the game does a good enough job of explaining the story without you necessarily having to read all the notes and journals word for word. It slowly feeds you bits and pieces of the story, just so enough that you are kept in the picture. And this story is a fairly interesting one. Very dark, obviously fitting with the rest of the game, filled with torture, kidnapping, and murder, which works fantastic with the rest to really solidify this one picture, creating these dynamics, those being supported by the aesthetics, and all of that working in harmony, which is why Amnesia is such a good horror experience. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about before the video gets way too long is going to be game pacing. It's something that I've mentioned already, but haven't really talked about. And now I don't necessarily mean story pacing, because we've got that covered. I mean difficulty pacing. In video games, there's a thing known as the difficulty curve. Now, this represents how you want the difficulty of your game to be paced, right? And as you can see, the line is pretty much a combination of highs and lows that keeps constantly growing. As the time progresses, your game obviously should get more difficult. However, it should not be a linear progression. Every time you see a peak, this represents a new challenge. And every time you see a low, this represents a moment to breathe out, relax, collect your composure after a challenge, and continue getting ready for the next challenge, which is going to be just a tad bit more difficult. This way, a game can keep you on edge without feeling bored in its story. Now, does Amnesia do that? The answer is, hell yes it does. So let's start from the beginning. The first peak could maybe represent the first time you see the monster. Now, when that happens, you are in no direct danger. It's just really a hallucination. The monster will not attack you, he will just walk off and give you a pretty solid scare if you're not expecting it. Obviously, it's a difficulty peak. Unless you know that the monster is no danger to you, you will be scared out of your boots, run back, hide, and then cower in fear while you wait for the music to stop. Once that happens, you get that bit of a break, time to relax, gain your composure, maybe change your underwear, and continue in the game. Now comes the next peak. The next time you see the monster, you see him, and he's still no real danger to you. However, if you run towards him, he will attack you. Now you're put into a situation which is more difficult than the previous one, only if by a little bit. And afterwards, once again, you get a moment to breathe out. And as you follow this trend, you can pretty much get through the whole game. Next time you encounter the monster, you actually have to hide or he will attack you. The next time you encounter him, he will attack you straight away, just run right into you. The next time, the game upgrades to a stronger enemy, or has more of them, or has more of the stronger enemies. As you see, Amnesia does a very good job in following this difficulty curve to a T, ensuring that the scares never get boring, and the difficulty is always there to keep you right on the edge of your seat. So, let's recap. What did Amnesia do so well that it became an instant horror hit back in 2010 when it was released? Well, first of all, it did things differently than all of its competitors. Second of all, it created a set of mechanics which perfectly support the dynamics of the game of survival horror, which are further solidified by really strong aesthetics in the MDA model, which all flows together really nicely. And lastly, the game does a great job at maintaining the difficulty curve, making sure you are challenged every second of your playthrough. And that is it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. What's important to remember is these were all my opinions. I am by no means an expert in this field, but I do actually have some experience with game design, so I suppose there could always be less competent people to talk about this. A few quick disclaimers before the video ends. I am by no means saying that Amnesia: The Dark Descent is the best horror game ever made. It has a few, if not more than a few, glaring issues which become apparent as you play through it. If you want to hear my opinions about those, I might suggest you check out my walkthrough or my review of the game, both of which are going to be in a playlist which is down in the description. If you agreed or disagreed with anything I said, please make sure to leave that down in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinion, guys, and maybe start an interesting discussion on the topic. That is it for me. I wish you all a beautiful rest of today, and I will see you all in the next video I make. Bye bye.